welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grandpre. Thank you for staying with us as we are now back with Black Liberation Media. And we appreciate all the support you've given us. Many of you will know our channel was recently permanently demonetized for a video that was uploaded about 3 months ago. We were under review, and the review came back not in our favor, so it was no new infraction. But it really shows we can't depend on large corporations to run advertising on our content. We can't depend on YouTube algorithms. We can't depend on constraining our creativity to what the algorithm and Google will accommodate. I know for me at least, it's been a deterrent to incorporating audio into the podcast that might trigger the YouTube copyright strikes. So I'm going to continue to operate around that, but it really just shows that it's your support that has really given us the opportunity to continue to support the collective. So please check out the Patreon page. Those of you who are subscribed via YouTube, I don't think that's an option anymore. So it's really the Patreon that's going to allow us to continue this work. And a few things in terms of housekeeping. We're going to continue to evolve this format for In Search of Black Power. The audio, the video, it's going to have to revolve around the schedule of our organization, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and the advocacy work we do. But we're committed to continuing to innovate and iterate and experiment about what is the best way to deliver the content. And a brief note on what the goal is for the content, at least for these audio episodes, as long as I'm doing them. Please continue to tell people about this work. One of the ideas is that people are reading these books. People are having conversations about these texts, and that determines the text we choose. But it is not a thing where people have to read these texts to understand this argument. It's not a book review podcast, so you don't have to have read the book to listen to the podcast. And in fact, it's almost the opposite. We're really looking for folks that maybe heard something about this book, and this book is like, man, I've been meaning to read that. And to give you some context to understand different ways to interpret the information when you read it, or, frankly, as an alternative to reading it. One of the things that I've come to a conclusion is that part of my intellectual training through debate, and just me as a person, is I like long quotes. I like reading long quotes. It's something I've got a lot of practice at. And part of the idea is we'll read the quotes to you. We'll cherry pick the best, most important quotes so you don't have to read the whole book if you don't want to. So this is part of the service that we feel we're providing to the community of like-minded folks who are interested in better understanding this content. So if you could share the word around, that'd be great. If you have feedback, you can actually email me directly at Lawrence, Lawrence, at LBS, the letters LBS, Baltimore, BALTIMORE.com. Because your feedback really does matter. Folks gave me some feedback on the last episodes, and it's really appreciated. I actually had a conversation to a reading group that actually was reading to some of us and was very careful about how I crafted the criticism. They probably would be shocked about how vociferous the criticism is in the podcast. But the idea is not to yuck anybody's yum or to denigrate the work these folks are doing, writing these books and going through a very capitalist constraining publishing process. The idea is that we have work to do. We have intellectual and political work to do for our community. And we want to continue to give folks the resources to do that work. So with that, the last thing I wanted to say is a content warning. This is a podcast about the book, The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He talks a lot about every single thing that could be traumatizing. Political trauma, sexual trauma, self-harm. And his book especially, I think, is part of my criticisms of it, or part of my idea contextualization of it, is that he leans very heavily into graphic depictions of the traumatic events in ways that I don't even find comforting as a person who believes we need to talk about the worst things that happen. So I'm going to read quotes from that book. I'm going to give contextualizations. I'm going to try not to focus on the most extreme examples of the trauma. But traumatic things do happen, and trauma is the focus of the book. So if you're particularly sensitive, I'll try to give content warnings within the flow of the episodes. Because again, one thing I'm realizing is these books are too complex for one. And sometimes even 2 episodes. We'll see, this could be a 3-parter. But I'll try to give context warnings, but I can't guarantee that I'll give a content warning for every single potential trigger at every single moment. So I'll do the best that I can, but please enter into the conversation knowing that I'm very cognizant, especially of this book. It is quite graphic in its depictions of very bad things happening to folks. And part of the idea is that as we will explore, if I take you somewhere traumatic, the goal will not be to leave you there. I'm not a trained healer, but I've been in so many healing conversations. I understand the importance of not leaving people in a state of trauma, but the idea is to get people through the river, as some of the experts we will discover as we go on this journey talk about, not leaving you wallowing in the space of trauma, but trying to give you the political and intellectual tools needed to see trauma in a political context and work with it and understand the political work a focus on trauma is doing, both in a positive and unfortunately in a negative way when it comes to the obsessive focus on trauma being applied to Black people and Black communities. So given that, and with that, thank you. Please continue to support LBS, continue to support Black Liberation Media, and continue to come with us in search of Black power. See you on the other side. Baltimore, the city where, of course, LBS is based out of, has declared itself wanting to be the nation's leader in what it calls trauma-informed care. Now, let me state here from the outset, I am not an opponent of trauma-informed care as it was originally set out. How it was originally set out was in the context of medical treatment, medical professionals in terms of mental health care, nursing treatment of people who've experienced traumatic events, especially with their body. The power medical professionals have over one's body can induce feelings of constraint, can induce feelings of not being cared about, being ordered around, that can trigger people's trauma if they're victims of physical assault, sexual assault. And given what many people say about some doctors is that they have a bit of a God complex, medical professionals can be inured and not cognizant of this power relationship and this traumatic relationship to people's bodies. In that context, I think trauma-informed care is an important corrective, but it also is, in my mind, basically the bare minimum that one can ask of a medical professional. And I think that's where I want to talk about the story of going to the Trauma-Informed Care Conference. So about 2 years ago, there was one of many in the city of Baltimore, Trauma-Informed Care Conference. And not to my surprise, this is why I was there, people were not talking explicitly about medical professionals. They were talking about children. They were talking about brain development in children. They were talking about how trauma-informed understandings of how trauma can impact brain development needs to be a structure through which we structure programming, especially for use. And there was a ton of very pretty, glowing brain scans displayed on the screen, talks about amygdalas, talks about other parts of the brain, hippocampuses, and basically saying our young people are so traumatized that makes them violent. We need to do things like help them meditate and dance to deal with their trauma. And there were often very graphic depictions of trauma. There were very graphic depictions of things that young people had been subjected to, and very celebratory depictions of dance and play. And because of my understanding of political economy and the lack of conversation of political economy, the lack of conversation of history, the lack of conversation of slavery, the lack of conversation of anything, spoiler alert, that would put this trauma-informed care framework into context, I felt a deep sense of agitation. And I realized that we have words for what was happening to me. I was being traumatized. The political conversation at a trauma-informed care conference was causing me trauma, because it's so disconnected from my understanding of the larger constellation of forces the Black community had to face. And with that, I realized We have been having this conversation in private for years. We've had this conversation with people in the field for years. It was time to have the conversation in public. And it was time to pick someone. Not that this person is the authority, not that this person is the best example even of trauma-informed care work. I'm sure some people in the field would claim they've gone beyond this person's work. But this is the guy who is seen as the core of bringing the field into the mainstream. His book is cited even in some of these more race-conscious trauma-informed care circles as at the heart of many people coming to this practice. And that, of course, is The Body Keeps Score. This book was written by Bessel van der Kolk. Please excuse the pronunciation if it is imperfect. He has worked in America, but he is from Europe. I believe he is from the Netherlands. And he has produced series about the physical impacts of trauma that have gone so far beyond conversations about therapists working with veterans, so far beyond conversations of doctors working with people who have been subjected to physical trauma, that was important to contextualize these ideas within the context of political economy, and specifically within LBS's perspective of Black community self-determination. It's important to briefly give some context for what the folks in the room thought they were doing and the political strategy behind it. Because this conversation really engages with our larger critique. Many episodes of In Search of Black Power have talked about a critique of public health as a framework for racial justice, and in many ways anathema to Black community self-determination. But the political idea is that there's such a huge push towards incarceration and pathologization of addiction, of Black youth deviance, that if we frame the idea as a health problem, that will push the problem away from the incarceration system and towards the medical system. And therefore, we can take the resources into the medical system that otherwise would have gone to the incarceration system. And part of our critique has been the hierarchical nature of the medical system, the technocracy, the expertise focus. If the goal is Black community self-determination, that this move, politically, though it seems to be a winner, is actually a loser for our community. But the trauma component adds another unique layer of emotional sophistication and nuance to this politics, because it is crafted so deeply in the language of empathy for our community. Many people who would otherwise be critical of white nonprofits and white saviors, they think about their own trauma. They think about the trauma their kids or their loved ones have gone through, and they're deeply susceptible to the argument that, in this case, a strategic alliance with public health to address the trauma Black communities face is worth the trade-off. So part of my analysis is going to be to understand the limitations of the trauma argument, but really to talk about, again, beyond trauma-informed care, the politics of trauma when it comes to Black communities like Baltimore deciding where to put resources, and how cultural conceptions of trauma determine the types of work and the types of trauma that are deemed legitimate, addressable, and valuable within a political context to build programming around, and what those programs view as the solution to trauma may be very different from an African-centered perspective versus a Eurocentric perspective. But as we did in the previous episode, I want to give the author space to talk about their argument in their own words. So as we did previously with Heather McGee, this is the author of The Body Keeps Score, Bessel van der Kolk, giving an explanation of his ideas in his own words. So I've been calling this in my brain the supercut. So here is a supercut that was actually produced by another entity, almost perfectly intact. We've chopped it up just a little bit for educational purposes. Obviously, this video is not monetized, so we want to just give you some exposure to Bessel van der Kolk's argument before we begin to deconstruct it. So here he is in his own words.
My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist. I have been studying trauma for about 50 years now. I've treated a whole variety of different traumatized populations, see trauma in many different countries around the world, and I am the author of the book, The Body Keeps Score. The mainstream system of of psychiatry, psychology is that there is something wrong with you and I need to fix you. That's a very different attitude than dealing with trauma. Around that time that I first started to work for the VA, a group of us started to define what trauma is and started to define what happens to people. 1978 was the year, and the Vietnam War was over by about 6 or 7 years. The very first day that I met Vietnam veterans, I was just blown away. They kept referring back to their dead comrades. Their hearts seemed to be with the people who were no longer around. They had a hard time loving their wives and girlfriends. They had a hard time being in any way meaningfully involved in the present. These were guys who were my age, who were smart and competent, but they clearly were just a shadow of their former self. And what was also really striking is they were sort of passive much of the time, and then people told them something that was disappointing, and they went from 0 to 10 and blew up and became extremely angry. Something seemed to have happened to them that made it very hard for them to modulate their responses to the environment. My colleagues and I started to think about how is what these guys suffer from different from what other people who are in psychiatry textbooks suffer from. So I dug up a book that was written in 1941 by Abram Gardner, who had been working with World War soldiers. He writes, these guys suffer from a physioneurosis. Their bodies continue to re-experience that very terrible, frightening situation. And that event keeps coming back in terms of images, behaviors, and physical sensations. So that became the core of our definition of PTSD. We write, these people have been exposed to an extraordinary event that's outside of normal human experience. And in retrospect, that shows us how ignorant and narrow-minded we were, because it turned out that this is not an unusual experience at all. Trauma is actually, unlike what we first thought, extremely common. 1 out of 5 women in America has a history of sexual molestation. Even a lot of men have histories of sexual molestation. 1 out of 4 kids get beaten very hard by their parents. 1 out of 8 kids see physical fights between their parents. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma. But when we started to work with inner city kids, the amount of trauma that these kids experienced was just unspeakable. The nature of trauma is that an experience enters into your ears, into your skin, into your eyes, and it goes down into a very primitive part of your brain that automatically interprets what is going on. Is this dangerous or is this safe? An event becomes traumatic when there is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable, and your body starts automatically going into a state of fight, flight, or collapse. The lingering effect of trauma is that you continue to react to mild stressors as if your life is in danger. And so you tend to become hyper-reactive. Somebody may irritate you in the supermarket. You may develop road rage. You may have a difficult time putting up with misbehavior from your spouse or your kids. And most people actually are barely aware or not aware at all that their reactions that they're having right now are actually rooted in experiences they have had before. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to things as if you're in danger. So the big challenge of treating trauma is how do we help people to live in bodies that feel fundamentally safe? The tradition in mental health is to dismiss the reality of people's lives. For example, it's only in the past few years that people are beginning to talk about the impact of poverty, or the impact of racism, or the impact of unemployment. And people have sort of been labeling people, oh, there's something wrong with you, let me fix you. But if you go to a physician or a mental health practitioner who doesn't understand that, they're going to try to fix you with drugs or cognitive behavioral treatment to not do these crazy things anymore. it usually doesn't work very well. What was very clear is that being in a relationship where people can hear you, where you can talk about how badly you feel, where you can talk about your guilt, and where you can start opening up where these feelings come from, how old these feelings are, and how you develop these feelings in response to particular things that happen to you, that was actually quite helpful.
It's part of my training in debate, and I think it's just good practice to acknowledge the best version of one's argument, even / especially when you end up disagreeing with it, and to present these ideas in the spirit of constructive communication to people. And I know there are, frankly, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people for whom these ideas in this book is very affirming and important to them. So with that, let's just acknowledge a few things about van der Kolk's argument. From the perspective he comes from, as an older gentleman who was doing his work in the 60s and 70s, the complete lack of conversation about trauma across fields was genuinely stunning. I was going to read one of the longer quotes from the book. I don't want to take up too much time, but I will read a piece of it because I think it's important to set up some conversation later. And I think it's important to understand where he comes from. So this is Bessel van der Kolk writing in the context of working with a veteran named Tom. At the end of duty, Tom was honorably discharged. All he wanted was to put Vietnam behind him. Outwardly, that's exactly what he did. He attended college, graduated from law school, married his high school sweetheart, and had 2 sons. But he sensed he wasn't normal. He felt dead inside. He often erupted into uncontrollable rages. When he returned for his appointment, I eagerly asked Tom how the medicines had worked. He told me he hadn't taken any of the pills. Trying to conceal my irritation, I asked him why. This is Tom speaking now. Quote, I realized that if I take the pills and the nightmares go away, I will have abandoned my friends, and their deaths will have been in vain. I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. I was stunned. Tom's loyalty to his dear friends was keeping him from living his own life. End quote. He goes on to say that after that he looked all through the library for books to talk about what Tom was experiencing, and he found almost nothing except a few old books about shell shock from World War I and II. So the deep level of ignorance in the medical fields about trauma that he comes from in the 60s and 70s was so profound, this push towards embodying trauma and centering it was a necessary corrective. And I do want to say that. I also want to say that part of the value of van der Kolk's argument, and this pops out throughout his book, is him questioning medication and cognitive behavioral technologies in treatment and looking at deeper physical embodiments of trauma and recommending less medicalized interventions for trauma. So part of the critiques of public health is tying it to in America, for-profit healthcare system. And to his credit, van der Kolk does not tie himself completely to that system in terms of some of its worst instantiations of just billing hours to do cookie-cutter cognitive behavioral treatment that just says, look at your brain, what's wrong with your thoughts, how do you correct those thoughts, but looking at it from the perspective of physical bodies and recommending things like movement as a cure, and challenging the push in the Western medical world to rely so heavily on pills. Now, because van der Kolk essentially starts at Vietnam, I think it's important for our criticism and contextualization of his arguments to start with Vietnam as well. That van der Kolk's analysis of the importance of trauma starts with Vietnam is interesting because in his text, we don't really have an analysis of the politics of Vietnam. So we don't have a political contextualization of what exactly is traumatic about being in Vietnam, except the fact that war is just generally traumatic. So the conversations about Vietnam being a fundamentally unjust war, in which America is on the side of essentially French colonial power, the distinctions between black GIs and white GIs, the idea of a black GI being drafted and forced to fight for a country that was not providing their human and civil rights, all of that is glossed over for a generic conception of trauma. And I think that that's really important, because even thinking about what is traumatic about one's experience in Vietnam, there are lots of stories about black GIs, soldiers, essentially having to shoot their superior officers, who are oftentimes young white men, because of the nature of racism. Because either the young white person was being explicitly racist and damaging towards them, or because of their, what we would now say is privilege, they were completely inured to any possibility of failure, any possibility of losing a battle, any possibility of danger from the Viet Cong because of racialized assumptions of American and white superiority. And they'd be leading these soldiers into deaths not knowing that's what they were doing. So even understanding which people are grievable in terms of the GI's quotes, in terms of having dreams about his soldiers who died, even understanding what specifically about their deaths is traumatic, the lost potential, the nature of dying for a country that doesn't care about you, versus other ways of interpreting one's experience in Vietnam, which we'll get to a bit later. He doesn't have much to say about that. He doesn't have much to say about a continuity between what one might be experiencing in the inner city, coming from an environment of systemic northern migration-induced violence and organized crime, and that potentially not being a break in terms of the violence of Vietnam, but a continuation of the structural violence that one faces. So then we go back to the quote we just listened to. For Van der Kolk, he says the violence experienced in inner cities is unspeakable. One could easily see it from a different perspective, as he, as a Dutchman, has nothing to say about it, because it's not his lived experience. And he, as a Dutchman, has no context for seeing the historical continuity between Vietnam and the contemporary inner city violence we see today. And I think the last thing I would say is that it's very interesting that his quote concludes with a conversation about how affirming it is to have someone recognize your trauma. And I do think that's a very good example of why this text and this theory has become not just so affirming and popular in certain organizing and treatment circles, but it's part of the larger culture of social media, where TikTok and Instagram, there's almost this incessant stream of people presenting their trauma, asking for affirmation from the digital masses, so much to the point where one could argue, and in fact many people have, that we've gone to the exact reverse of where Van der Kolk started in the 60s, where if in the 60s we were so denying of trauma, today it has been grafted onto certain bodies and certain performances in a way to demand public sympathy and to shut down public criticism, that it's become a form of currency that people are wielding in ways that I don't think this text anticipated or accommodates, because these things operate in very cultural ways. And because of Eurocentric culture's denial of trauma, Van der Kolk didn't have, or doesn't have, from what I can see, tools to accommodate the ways in which trauma has been deployed by a younger generation as a form of currency. Indeed, what was so revelatory for Van der Kolk, coming from a Eurocentric worldview, connecting the mind to the body, the separation itself is, of course, many of us know, and I believe we have talked about on this podcast before, is an artifact of a particular cultural Eurocentric formation of I think, therefore I am, the separation of the mind from the body. The mind being the land of rationality and control over the body's base impulses in a European context. Other cultures, of course, this connection of trauma to the body would not be revelatory, because their vision of the self is always already existing in connectedness between the mind, the body, history, the future, the past, the social, and the spiritual. So this raises a question. If this analysis of trauma is so important, what do Black people, and specifically folks operating from African cultures, have to say about the rise of trauma-informed care as a frame of analysis? Because, of course, unfortunately, the continent of Africa has more than its fair share of trauma, and to think that we needed someone like Bessel van der Kolk, which I think is unfortunately some of the intentional or unintentional flavor of some of the conversations in trauma-informed care spaces, to think that we just started thinking about trauma in the context of the Eurocentric Academy recognizing its value in the 2010s is indeed quite, shows what you think about African people to not think we have our own indigenous conceptions of trauma. Indeed, in the course of looking for African-centered responses to the trauma-informed care movement, I found a text from, and again, excuse the pronunciation, Ray Motsai and Make Masengo, Redefining Trauma in an African Context, a Challenge to Pastoral Care. And this is from 2012, so this would have been before Van der Kolk publishes his book, but these folks, not surprisingly, are talking about and responding to Van der Kolk's other scholarly work in this text, explaining how it's important to understand trauma from an African-centered context in order to interpret how it should be applied to people operating from an African-centered worldview. So this is Motsai and Masango talking about African-centered conceptions of trauma. Western psychiatric studies have spearheaded the work on trauma influenced most of the international world. Western dualistic worldview separates uncommon events occurring in the mind or body into two broad psychopathological categories, organic and psychosocial disorders. This dualism was made popular by René Descartes. This egocentric self refers to an understanding of the individual as a self-contained, autonomous unit. Most of the world's populations outside of the West holds on to a more social-centric conception of self, where individuals exist within networks of social relationships. This is critical in the sense that the way in which we define trauma is influenced about how we perceive reality. Oxford defines trauma as an anxiety disorder caused by major personal stress or a major serious or frightening event. It does not mention the community or communal nature of an African life. From a Western perspective, culture is interpreted as a sense of beliefs, a secondary element, which are superimposed onto the tangible realities of biology. Such thoughts are considered superstitious. The beliefs in science and the power of the international scientific community is so strong that it tends to marginalize local knowledge. Therefore, a community-based and social-sensitive approach is needed when dealing with traumatized people. The traditional African worldview and the African worldview. Life is perceived as holistic rather than being compartmentalized. A human being is perceived as a whole person whose core is his or her spirituality. There is no distinction between religious or secular life. The concept of Ubuntu is essential. I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. Pain and stress in Africa is perceived by the people as a problem affecting the community and not just individuals. Reciprocal and interpersonal privileges and obligations are more important than the rights of the individual. Dualism will lead to the mistreatment of African trauma survivors as they become alienated from the community. The African holistic worldview and approach should emerge as the most relevant philosophical and methodological choice. Globally, most groups of people experience any suffering, including trauma, as an integration of body and spirit in a social context. The formation of proper practice, theology, methodology is therefore crucial. The same experience and events do not cause trauma the same effects to all people. Political violence in Africa are amongst the greatest cause of trauma on the continent, and we must therefore make a concerted effort to eradicate it. This kind of trauma is difficult to deal with because it's not simply a medical or psychological problem, but rather a social-political issue. Culture and religion are also contributors to the ethos of violence. We intend to pioneer an African approach to torture and resulting trauma, which centers on a psychosocial approach as an attempt to be relevant. This is proven scientific approach that argues many scholars, including Van der Kolk, when culture and social support which is the first line of defense against trauma, is disenabled. A sudden overwhelming collapse of the traditional system ensues. There's a problem of medicalizing this sequence of basic human rights responses to political oppression and human cruelty. It shifts attention away from human rights and the prevention of violence to objectifying of a political neutral diagnosis of modern medicine. There is a danger that responses to trauma may be underestimated by limiting them only to psychological trauma, which will eventually result in a diagnosis of PTSD. Trauma impacts body, mind, and spirit, and when it's experienced at a level of community, the whole immediate society is affected. These experiences refuse to integrate into a larger narrative of meaningful life in cultural terms. The community provides the basis for a sense of belonging and fosters a common identity. Culture provides a health maintenance system, the function of which is to assure that the adequate sharing of values, resources, and social relationships. End quote. I think it's important that the authors cite Bessel van der Kolk in their analysis, because the argument at the end of the day is not whether trauma is important or not. It's not even necessarily whether trauma can be seen in the body or not. It is what is the interpretation of the body. What is the cultural and political framework in which these ideas are implanted? Because in the African-centered context, the body extends beyond the physical body. It expands backwards in time, and it expands outward in the context of community. So if the body keeps score, foreshadowing an idea we're going to come back to later, the body politic keeps score. And thinking about communal bodies raises the question of what these ideas do to the body politic, not just the physical body. And when we look at the quote, we see that these authors too, almost 15 years ago at this point, are concerned that locating trauma in the individual diagnoses of the individual, who can be seen as having PTSD, ignores the violence done to the cultural body politics through things like political violence. It is not a large jump to then look at the nonprofit industrial complex, the public health industrial complex, and the way it undermines sovereignty in African nations around the world, to then see trauma-informed care as a potential vector of trauma to the body politic by constraining collective sovereignty. Additionally, taking a step back into the individual bodies now, let's look back at the small quote I read to you from Bessel van der Kolk at the beginning after the supercut, where he talks about this specific example that so worried him about a soldier saying, if I take those drugs, I won't dream, I won't see my friends, I won't be able to live for them. That he so instinctively pathologizes that statement as an extension of trauma, ignores more complex and diunital, as opposed to dichotomous, African people's visions of health and wellness, which do not accept the trauma of warfare as inevitable or good, as this quote clearly states, but says that a collective cultural conception of extended subjectivity gives us a different relationship to what it might mean to live for the dead. In an African people's worldview, not venture to say a lot of the worldviews of people listening to this podcast, that's not a bad thing. It's something to work with. It's the beginning of a framework in which an intelligent, in my mind, trauma-informed care theorist would say, let's work with that. What would your deceased individuals want you to do with your life, and how might your symptoms be precluding you from that? But that he has such a visceral reaction that an individual would have their life possibilities constrained due to fidelity to a community of individuals who have passed. I think that's a big example of the core of the need to center cultural analyses of trauma. What is the goal? What does health look like? What is the cultural, spiritual system of health in which these ideas are placed? It's not about trauma mattering or not. It's about understanding that for African people, if dreams have traditionally for African people been a window into the collective spiritual foundations of something perhaps beyond ourselves, that impacts how you see psychoanalysis. That impacts how you do your counseling. That impacts how you see these dreams as the definition of trauma for Bessel van der Kolk versus a part of a larger tapestry of spiritual, communal, cultural connections that may be the logical result of this analysis from an African-centered worldview. There are some very specific effects from framing trauma as an individualized medical disease. Part of that means that we can see trauma universally throughout all brains using things like brain scans. And this has been used as one of the biggest defenses of trauma as a disease that should be addressed by medical interventions, because the ability to see changes in people's brain scans means that it's empirically proven, and we can use the empirical proof, and this is important, as a way to get beyond the political backlash. If the idea is that spending money to address anybody's suffering is politically unpopular, if we show folks these brain scans, it says, look what's happening to folks' amygdala. They're losing their ability to regulate their emotions. Then even folks who are not compelled to support spending money for these sort of things can say, well, the science is undeniable. And it's important to interrogate this because it's one of the strongest components of all trauma-based interventions is usually specifically fMRI scans that talk about specific parts of the brain being critical to certain types of emotional and social functioning, and basically by arguing the degradation of the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex allows for proof of the long-term health impacts and also long-term behavioral and critically potentially criminal impacts of trauma. So whether it's lost productivity from people not being able to work or increased spending on incarceration, you basically make this physical manifestation argument that these seemingly abstract, soft things are going to physically code themselves into people's brains. That's going to lead to all this bad, expensive stuff for our society down the line, so you might as well help them out now and give them some trauma-informed care. And it's important to understand how this fits within Eurocentric cultural frameworks of technological advancement that kind of gets grafted onto our political theory, where many people have noted certain Western societies today being obsessed with technology and technological solutions to problems and raising science to the level essentially as God in our increasingly secular world. And you can imagine like the sort of slick graphics packages whenever there's a new iPhone rollout, and how excited people are at technological advancement and the feeling of progress and the feeling that technology will solve all of our problems. It kind of creates this emotional, cultural sense of pleasure in how people talk about these problems. Even though the problems are bad, they get excited when they show the brain scans. And they say, you can't argue with it. Look, there it is, it's glowing, that part of the brain. And the ability to see into the mind almost becomes like a God's eye view. It's the ability to predict the future almost. And there's this incredible rush of power that comes across some folks when they talk about this issue, even when it would seemingly call for a more empathetic, a more compassionate, and a more humble relationship to the issue. And I think that's where it's important for us to challenge these notions of objective neuroscience and fMRI machines being this scientific trump card that folks are believing that they're playing when they're talking about these trauma-informed care spaces. Now, because of things we're going to talk about a bit later, it's actually pretty hard to find comprehensive, digestible critiques of neuroscience, because so many people in so many different fields are trying to use neuroscience as their trump card. And this is not to say that neuroscience isn't valuable, but it's the culture, it's the cultural consumption and the attempt to turn it into political capital that takes these theories out of the realm of actual empirical science, where you'd actually recognize the limitations of individual brain scans. You talk about things like sample size, you talk about things like the complexity of the brain. It's amazing how deeply simplified all these conversations become of complex, nuanced, literally quantum science. Becomes so simple when it's time to talk about the brain and trauma and prefrontal cortexes and amygdala's one-to-one mapping of complex emotions and complex behaviors on the specific parts of the brain that the scan at one moment in time, and one person, and one machine happens to flare up. So the best example that I found of a comprehensive in one place critique of not all neuroscience, but the politics, the cultural politics of neuroscience to be used as a tool to promote particular interventions is actually in critiques of mindfulness, critiques of the ways that mindfulness has been deployed. Ironically, one of the most dominant methodologies of trauma-informed care, folks, is mindfulness. But it's in the mindfulness community, the fact that it comes from Buddhism, comes from deep cultural traditions of Asia, but how it's been commercially repackaged for consumption and nonprofit service community, nonprofit consumption of mindfulness, that people have been very critical of the complex cultural technology of mindfulness being repackaged with this neuroscience sheen onto it. So it's actually Robert Posner in his book McMindfulness, which I highly recommend, where he actually has aggregated his critiques of how mindfulness has used fMRI technology to try to justify mindfulness as an evidence-based methodology. In his critique and contextualization of the fMRI studies, I think it's very important to apply within the complex of understanding how I believe trauma-informed care is doing a very similar thing. So here's Robert Posner in his book McMindfulness, talking about the ways in which neuroscience is being strategically oversimplified and politically deployed within a technology-obsessed culture to create simple answers to what he feels are complex problems. As a simple explanation for the popularity of mindfulness, the science, says John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness works. Although brain scans show some of the active networks involved in the situations where mindfulness helps, the underlying mechanisms that explain how it, quote-unquote, works remain unclear. In an unusually forthright assessment, a recent review of research by 3 prominent neuroscientists describes our understanding of brain changes due to mindfulness as, quote, trivial. Many of the articles published so far have major flaws, including a lack of replication, a bias towards positive or significant results, the absence of elaborated theories, and post hoc conclusions, among other drawbacks, the article notes. It reduces the mind to the brain, despite the lack of evidence for this assumption, while glossing over the fact that almost any repetitive practice has similar effects, from playing the violin to driving a taxi around the streets of London. The truthiness of Stephen Colbert, who satirized alternative facts long before the Trump era. What matters is not what's true, but how things feel, and mindfulness feels very, quote, sciencey. Authors of mindfulness studies tended to downplay negative findings, given the smaller sample size and weak statistical power of the pool of mindfulness studies examined. He continues, colorful pictures of brains are often featured in media reports touting evidence that the science has verified the efficacy of mindfulness. That comes from neuroscientific studies using functional MRI machines, fMRI, of meditators' brain states. Their before and after shots are seen as official stamps of legitimacy, incontrovertible proof of functional and structural changes in the brain, even if the neuroscientists who produced them are more circumspect about the actual significance of increasing the size of gray matter, shrinking the amygdala, or quieting the default mode network. Under the title The Seductive Allure of Neuroscience Explanations, Dana Weisberg and her colleagues found that even bogus and bad explanations for scientific phenomena are seen as more satisfying by most people when couched in the language and dazzling visual vocabulary of neuroscientists. There's also the flawed assumption that neural correlates of brain states shown on colorful fMRI scans can explain first-person experiences. This rests on the premise that mindfulness is a form of inner observation of a private mental realm inside the brain, resembling a, quote, theater of the mind, but that imagines an enlightenment ideal of a truly objective inner observer. while reducing mindfulness to the purely biological, ignoring the influence of contextual factors, social, cultural, economic, cosmological, on meditative experiences. Such a reduction in view perpetuates the ill-conceived notion that, as scholar of Buddhism David McCann puts it, that meditation can be isolated from the rest of life for the sake of scientific study. By suggesting that we can see inside the brain in an unmediated way, fMRI scans oppose what Michel Foucault calls a regime of truth, end quote. They appear to show the clear signs of something significant, but there's actually always activity across the whole brain, even at times of so-called rest. The brighter parts of fMRI images show the most metabolically active regions, which may actually only be a few percent more active than regions colored gray. The images are actually statistical patterns of brain-wide metabolic activity, and contrary to what much of the public believes, they don't actually show engagement of specific regions as if they were mental organs of any meaningful sense. Nor are they snapshots of cognitive activity actually taking place in the brain. That occurs at the microscopic level. The use of specific regions in just a way to make analysis tractable. Brain scans are complex composites of statistical mapping and averaging of multiple data points in subjects. Brain imaging is about indirect measurement of cell activity in huge aggregates rather than at a cellular level, which is where the brain actually performs its electrochemical processing. As my colleague David Lewis points out, fMRI images only resolve down to cubes of tissue measuring 1 to 3 millimeters a slide, each of which has upwards of 1 million neurons. Lewis provides a useful metaphor for brain imaging studies, comparing them to trying to deduce the economic and social structure of New York City by observing the movements of vehicles from an airplane. One can see Lower Manhattan is active from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., with a spike in foot traffic around noon. On that basis, one may gain the crude idea of what's going on. But any assertion of financial and theater industry work would be unreliable guesses. In effect, fMRI images of brain activity amount to a simulation, which in itself is not problematic. But the problem here is with fMRI simulations is that their pictorial presentations create a powerful illusion of accurate indirect images of phenomenological mental states, what Nicholas Rose and Joel Abbey Richard refer to as a visual imagery. This is a little like the phrenologists of the 19th century who mapped and measured the contours of the human skull as meaningful assessments of character, emotional disposition, and mental states. Analysis of large data sets of neuroimaging data demonstrates that there is no one-to-one correspondence within a particular brain region and particular cognitive functions. Rather, any given region is activated across a wide array of tasks. Thompson says, even the latest attempts to understand brain regions in terms of networks still fail to show any one-to-one connection. This multiplicity has turned out to be true of every brain region involved in cognitive and emotion. Worse, even trying to understand and structure the various precursors for each region have not led to scientific consensus on mental functions in terms of regions or subregions. Cognitive functions are not just in the head, but are embodied, involving an array of affective and bodily skills that are situated in social environments. Decontextualizing it promotes the myth that it is a private mental state detached from social and cultural context. Viewed this way, it can be promoted as a way to, quote, train your brain, and scientific careers can be bankrolled with millions of dollars in government funding for brain mapping studies, end quote. As someone who's read that book and obviously produced that clip of specifically talking about neuroscience, it actually is stunning just to kind of reread that. What do you do when you feel what you're doing is right? You have this tool, this trump card that you believe will secure support for interventions you believe save lives. Just one unfortunate thing about that trump card, it happens to be a gross mischaracterization of the actual science. And I can't tell you how often these people wave these brain images like a lawyer waving the Constitution. And to remember that glowing brain on an fMRI scan is literally just a flow of blood, a few percentages more than the flow of blood throughout the rest of the brain. In the name of science, we're creating a pseudoscience. In the name of us being the smart, college-educated, liberal, caring people, we're just having to completely bastardize complex realities of the actual human brain. And even in the context of what I'm supposed to be telling you right now, according to my outline, I have to maybe even just verify it, modify it just a little bit. It's because we're traumatized. We're politically traumatized. We believe that the only methodology that will ever bring political advancements for oppressed people is appealing to the cultural and psychological sentiments of the elites. Because we know they're obsessed with science, we give them what we think can fit within their cognitive frameworks. Unfortunately, it happens to kind of be wrong, but hey, what's a little bit of truth between friends, right? And I want to frame that as trauma because it is a theory of change. And that's what was happening to me at that conference. What was not on the table for the people at that conference was to explain to them that their theory of change locked them into a way of presenting data that, because I already read this book, I knew was extremely oversimplified, but completely denies the agency of oppressed peoples to build political theories to meet their own needs in a way that does not demand that they politic their brokenness, their literal broken brains. The physical manifestation of which is these fMRI images to people begging them to care about their suffering. That's traumatic. That's traumatic. If Bessel van der Kolk is correct, and I love this quote again because hilariously, he is pointing out that Bessel van der Kolk's own theory of the embodied connection between the body and the mind invalidates the prioritization of abstracted fMRI images as this holy grail of science, which of course van der Kolk himself relies upon quite heavily throughout his book. But if these fMRI images are the physical manifestation of these broken brains, and if Bessel van der Kolk is correct when he says that trauma means we feel we cannot move, it is ironically, in this case, the trauma-informed movement that has locked itself into a vision of politics that is a manifestation of its political trauma, of the political trauma of the American left, of the political trauma of austerity, of Nixon, of Reagan, and therefore replicates that politics of trauma because it constrains the body politic of oppressed people. By attempting to provide services through a hierarchized, technocratic, nonprofit industrial complex, it forces black and brown people to sacrifice the freedom of movement of their body politic to what elites will accept. And that, in reality, is traumatic. And that's why I wanted to start with my personal experience of that conference, because this is the dynamic we have to address. There is so much more to talk about in this book, but I want to end it here for episode 1, because we have a lot of stuff to get to. But it is the reality that it is the people who are positioning themselves using fMRI science, using mindfulness, using this political theory of appealing to elite visions of technocratic change, technical progress as the best methodology to get meaningful investments for oppressed people. That's a manifestation of your trauma. And you need to heal from that. But you cannot replicate and demand oppressed people adhere to a vision of political reality that is really a manifestation of your trauma and your ignorance of black and brown people's ability to move politically in ways that allowed them to get resources without having to politic their brokenness as a precondition for getting those in power to give a damn about them. we hope you enjoyed that episode of In Search of Black Power. Honestly, I have so much more to say about this text. And fortunately, with the miracle of digital technology, I can keep working through my outline, but that's going to be for the next episode for you all. So thank you. Please stick with us. The next episode, we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences. We're going to finish up the loop, talking about some of the limitations of neuroscience and really linking trauma and the way it's been politicked and deployed to systems of policing. Trauma-informed preemptive policing, I believe, will be one of the topics of our next podcast. And really setting up the final conversation, which I believe will probably have to be its own episode, about how we actually heal and how culturally specific conceptions, viewing culture as a healing technology, means we have to challenge some of the assumptive logics around what are appropriate forms of mourning, appropriate forms of expressing one's trauma, and what are the cultural artifacts and communal technologies that manifest culturally appropriate forms of not just politicking our trauma, getting it recognized by those in power, but actually getting through it and getting us to the point where we can continue to live in the fullness of life beyond trauma. So thank you. This is a lot, and we look forward to continuing to address these issues. We look forward to engaging in conversation and community with those working on these issues, and look forward to walking with you all in search of Black Power. See you soon.